You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 59. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I am so excited to be welcoming you all this week, and especially to be welcoming our very special guest. Her name is Estelle Winsett. She is a lawyer turned director of professional development, and she also happens to wear multiple other hats. She is a style coach. She is a mother of 3 boys. She comes from a family of lawyers. And what I think you will all find particularly interesting, not that those are not already interesting, but you'll find particularly interesting about Estelle is that she has curated her career with intention, creativity, and courage. And today we are going to talk about all of those things, how to style your career. So Estelle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Estelle, it is so nice to have this chance to speak with you. I was wondering if you could tell our guests today a little bit about yourself, including the work that you do now.
Sure. So I started off as a practicing attorney, and I come from a family of lawyers. So my dad was a very strong influence on me at a young age. And I always just knew I wanted to be an attorney. And so I kind of did the traditional path. I went straight from undergrad to law school and started practicing here in Memphis. And I really enjoyed it. Practiced for about 7 years doing employment law defense litigation. And then I got married and knew I wanted to start a family. And the one thing that was different from my experience and my dad's experience is that I had a hard time separating work from home. I kind of got a little tired of some of the antagonistic nature of a lot of the matters I was working on. And I just didn't know if I wanted to start a family in that kind of headspace. I felt like I really couldn't be home and not thinking about a case or a strategy. So I started looking at options of ways I could use my law degree. And I kind of stumbled into my first non-legal career, which was as a legal recruiter. So it was kind of a funny story. I went to talk to a contract company to see about maybe being a contract attorney. And the guy who was interviewing me ended up asking me if I would consider working for him for the company, which was never my original intention. But it was really cool as a way to keep my law degree active and then also work a part-time schedule, because that's what I wanted to do. When I went to interview with him, I was pregnant and with my first child. So I ended up starting work for him when my child was 3 months old, and I was working part-time, and it was super fun. I interviewed lawyers and paralegals, and I placed them with law firms and in-house legal departments. And so I got into this career development space where I was looking at resumes all day long and trying to play matchmaker. And so I started seeing ways that people could promote themselves better through their resume, that maybe they weren't adequately conveying what they did, and their cover letters weren't necessarily persuasive. And so I kind of started helping people with their resumes and cover letters. And I worked there for about 6 years. I ultimately transitioned from part-time to full-time. And I heard about a position at the law school, my alma mater, because they had an opening for their director, or rather of their dean of career services. And several people reached out to me and said, I really think you would be a good fit for this. And so I started researching it, and I started reaching out to people who held that position at other universities and law schools, and started to kind of get my head around it and decided, I really do want to do this. And so I ended up taking kind of charge of it. And I set a meeting with the current dean of the law school, and I didn't tell him why. I just set up an appointment, and he'd been my professor. I'm trying to think what he taught. I think it was business law, but in any event, he was super nice. And so I just kind of showed up and was like, so I hear there's this position and I think I would be a good fit for it. And I wanted to talk to you about it. So he ended up walking me down the hallway, showing me where the office was. And at that point, I don't think that applications had closed yet. So I'd already submitted my application. And then it just kind of went from there. And I was able to meet with him and the others that were on the recruiting committee. And anyway, so I got that role. What really appealed to me about that role was that it was a reinvention. My predecessor had been there for 15 years and the office actually had been vacant, I think, for about 10 months. And so I was able to start from the ground up and create a really strong career services office in the way that I felt was the best way. I wasn't hemmed in by things that having to be done a certain way. And so that was super fun. And I did that for about 3 years. And about that time, we had a new dean that started at the law school. And it just wasn't as good of a fit for me anymore. And so I started looking at other options. And that's when I decided I wanted to take the part of career services that I loved and parlay it into a law firm position. And so I started researching all the options out there and figured out that what I really wanted to do was professional development at a law firm. And so I kind of put my feelers out, and then a position became available where I am now for their first director of professional development. And it was perfect. And I was very excited. And so I did a lot of research again and just put my best foot forward about how my skills were transferable, because I had talked to other people in that same role in other firms, and just positioned myself to start this new role at the firm. And I've been here now for about 7 years. So that's kind of a long-winded way of explaining my career path.
Beautiful. No, I'm so glad you explained it like that, Estelle. And it wasn't long-winded at all. In fact, I think it was quite concise relative to all that you've done. And a few things that I would love to highlight about the path you've taken is number one, I think in that contract role, you had that position of the recruiter. And I think that's such a neat perspective to have because like you said, you're seeing the CVs come in, you're seeing the cover letters, you're seeing how different candidates distinguish themselves and how they could distinguish themselves better, which I think is a very unique perspective to have because not everybody sees that same amount of volume, right? Each of us is writing our own materials. We don't necessarily have the benefit of comparing them to other people's materials and doing that analysis. So I think that's a really neat skill set that you have. And then to bring that to the role in the law school. And I didn't know that you'd kind of sought out the dean and had a chat beforehand about the position, because I think you're so great at this. I think you really have a knack for looking at something and deciding, okay, what is a really great approach for me to do this? Like, how can I learn more about the position? How can I figure out whether this is the right position for me? So I just love that. And then you talked about the transition into the position that you're in now. And there's a story, I've heard it before, and I'm going to ask you to share it with our guests because it's so good, about how you approached your interview for your current role. Please share with us, Estelle.
Sure. So as I was looking into finding a role in a law firm setting that would be best suited for me, I talked to a lot of colleagues that had been presenters at some of the conferences I had attended. So the thing about career services for the law firm and law school setting is there's an overriding organization called NALP, and there are conferences every year that speak to both the PD role in the law firm setting and the PD role in the law school setting. And so I had attended a lot of presentations that have been from law firm PD professionals. And as I always would tell the law students, I reached out to them because anyone who takes the time to do a presentation cares about the topic. And when you follow up and tell them how much you enjoyed that conversation, you're creating a relationship. And so I then parlayed that further into having informational interviews to find out a little more about what they did. And so I surveyed a bunch of different people who did both recruiting and professional development at law firms. I looked at LinkedIn job descriptions of people who were at law firms. And what I always would tell the law students to do is, well, if you're interested in a position, go look and see what job descriptions you can find, because that's going to tell you what skills are most important for that role. And so after doing all that research, I landed on wanting to do PD at a law firm. And I knew I wanted to stay in Memphis because I have 3 boys and my husband here and both of our my in-laws and my family live in Memphis. And so at that point, the boys were young and I didn't want to look somewhere beyond Memphis. And there weren't as many opportunities for PD and law firms in Memphis. It was a relatively newer area that was taken off more in bigger cities, more northern cities than in the South. But I also kind of had my feelers out, like this is kind of what I'm looking for. And so someone let me know that there was a new position at this firm. It appealed to me because it was the first time they'd ever had a director in this role. It was a whole new department. And so what I did is I went back to all of my notes that I had made from my informational interviews. And I'd asked, what are transferable skills from a dean of career services to a director of PD? And so I had an ability to craft a resume that was really pointed and relevant to this role. And it's kind of a funny story because by the time I went to apply for the position, they had taken it down. So the job posting was not online very long because they got flooded with resumes from attorneys who were like, that sounds good, I can do that. But they weren't targeted resumes. They weren't thoughtful. And they were just so overwhelmed that they're like, okay, I'm shutting this down. So I had to go about finding someone in the law firm to pass my resume on to because I could no longer post. And so I found a friend of my sister's who practiced in the Mississippi office, sent her my resume, and she got it to HR. And so that's how I got my first interview at this company. So I distinguished myself by just having a very targeted and thoughtful resume. And then when I went into the interview, I'd also talked to other people who did PD at the law firms to say, okay, well, if you were starting a new position, what would be some of the first things you would do? Like in your first 3 months, what's the most important thing to do? And in doing those calls, I realized that you really needed to do a needs assessment and determine from the leaders in the firm, what's the most first priority to work on for someone who's a new director of professional development. And so I just laid out a business plan for what I anticipated and what I would do as the new director in this role for the first 3 months. And during the interview, I at one point just pulled it out of my briefcase and said, well, if I were to have this role, this is what I would do in the first 3 months. And this is why. And so I think they weren't expecting that. And, it's kind of these little things that I tried to teach the law students when I was at the law school. And what I try to teach people here, attorneys at the firm, is you got to be proactive about your career and distinguish yourself because no one's going to care about your career as much as you do. And so I distinguished myself from the other applicants because a lot of people had just said, well, why not? I'll apply for this role. It sounds good. But they hadn't done the research. So that's what I did.
Estelle, I love every step of that story. And thank you so much for sharing it because you have literally shown how to step by step, right? From the very beginning, attending the NALP conferences, listening to the speakers, following up the speakers to tell them that you enjoyed what they talked about. I mean, this is something that I encourage everyone to do, especially now with Zoom. You can watch all these seminars. There are people speaking.
Yes.
There are opportunities to meet and connect with people where what they're talking about resonates with you. And as you pointed out, probably resonates with them as well because they're talking about it. So I just love how, and then you have your notes from your informational interviews, and then, you went as far, and then you distinguished your CV, your cover letter, and then you showed up with a business plan. I just love it, pulling it out of the briefcase. Here's your first 3 months. And I just think this is such a compelling story because there's so many lawyers out there who are thinking about making transitions, who are going through the process, who are wondering, why am I sending my CV and not getting anybody responding to it? It's like, because when you approach it with that level, like you said, that intentionality, right? Distinguishing yourself and showing how this is such a great opportunity for both of you, right? That's when the magic happens. And so I just love that. Thank you so much.
Of course.
So wonderful. I know everyone listening is like, oh, that was so valuable.
Good.
I love it. And Estelle, so you are working with, I gather, students and associates and helping them all with their professional development. You've worked with students in a law firm context, helping them figure out how to navigate those early stages of interviews and finding the right firm. So what I would love to ask you is what questions you think early stage lawyers should be asking themselves in order to thrive professionally?
Oh, gosh, such a great question. So I think early stage lawyers should be asking, what are the skills I need to have as a junior associate? And really drilling down into what that means and talking to partners, finding out what it is that they're looking for the associates to provide them. What are their pain points and how can they satisfy them in a way that's very intentional. And I think as that associate rises within the ranks, those expectations change. And so it's important as a mid-level associate to find out, okay, what are the expectations of me now? And how can I meet them? And if some of those expectations are substantive skills or having certain milestones that they've done within their practice, if they haven't done that, they need to go out and get that. And that could mean several things. If they're one of the skills for a litigator is you need to have taken a deposition by your third year in practice. If you haven't done that, find people that will allow you to shadow them as they take depositions, even if you can't bill for it. Then be a resource for that attorney after the deposition, before, find out, okay, how did they come up with the questions? Afterwards, tell them your thoughts, what you noticed, what you thought was helpful, because when you're giving a deposition, it's hard to both ask the questions and receive the information and process it. So make yourself an asset to that attorney, learn the skill that you're trying to learn, and just be really proactive about it. That's just one example that comes to mind.
It's an excellent example. Thank you. And so you think it's really being intentional, asking for input from the lawyers in your department, whatever department you're in. What are the expectations? Because sometimes it'll be written down. Sometimes there's a whole flow chart of here's where you should be, but not always. And sometimes it's more organic than that. And so just making sure that you're tapped into your relationships, that you're asking those types of questions so that they can give you that feedback. Because like you said initially, Estelle, I think you're right. I think each of us is most concerned with our own careers relative to, others will care about you, but they will not necessarily do that extra level of work that it's sort of incumbent on each of us to do. So I love that, being proactive. You mentioned earlier in terms of career planning, again, it's that idea of being very intentional about it. What else do you recommend in terms of an approach for proactively planning your career? And you might look at your own example in terms of, okay, looking at the different stages, and when one thing didn't fit, it was time to move on to something else. So what would you recommend to others, to lawyers who are thinking about their own career planning?
I think being able to tap into, are you happy, is a really good question to ask.
That's a great question. Yes.
I know that sounds kind of, elementary, but it's so easy to get in a pattern of just, okay, here's an assignment, something is given to you and you do the task. And then there's a new assignment and you do the task. And it's very easy to look up 5 years later and think, I don't even like this task, but you've been doing it because it's what you do, and you haven't. And that's, again, kind of working in a career by default instead of by intentionality. And so when you have those moments or those red flags of, I know I started doing this kind of practice, but I'm not really sure it's giving me the same satisfaction or the satisfaction that I hoped it would. And if that's the case, then you need to pivot, because if you don't take charge of it, then you could be stuck in a career. And then you get to a point where it's really hard to switch gears. If you've been practicing in one area for 20 years, it's kind of hard to reinvent yourself in a different area of law. It can be done, but it's harder. And so having maybe these checkpoints along the way to see, am I happy? And if not, how can I either improve the situation or change it? So those are some things that have been kind of guiding principles for me. And I haven't always been as intentional, but later on in life, I started doing that. And it's made a big difference in my personal satisfaction and in learning and growing in my profession and helping other people.
I think it's such an important point to highlight, Estelle. And so thank you. I think just checking in with yourself and asking, are you happy? I don't know that that's the first question that people typically ask themselves. And yet, if they did, then what is the answer? And what does that lead to? So I think that's fabulous insight. And as I look at you, I'm thinking, you seem very happy. and I think what you've also done, and we're going to start talking about this too now, is I mentioned in the introduction that you are a style coach. So you wear all these different hats. And one of them is some personal, professional style. And I've followed some of what you have on your website. I've joined your Facebook group, which I talk about. And one of the things that I heard you say is that when you go out to shop, for example, you don't go out shopping without a list, right? That you need to have your list. You need to know in advance what it is that you're going to buy. And not doing that is kind of like going into the grocery store when you're hungry without a list. And we all know where that ends up. So to me, there's this real intentionality that you have in your approach to style. And I see this intentionality in your approach to career planning. And so I'm wondering if you might be able to talk about some of the parallels that you see between being intentional in your career and being intentional in your style.
Sure. So, like what you wear, how you show up in a law firm or in your job says a lot about you before you really ever open your mouth. And so, it's, as I was mentioning earlier, I think it's really easy in our style or in our career to just go about by default. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, except for you can lose sight of your bigger goals. And the parallels that I see when it comes to style is how you present yourself matters. And a lot of people think that, I should be appreciated for my intellect. I'm a lawyer. I've worked really hard to be here. And while that is true, there is a part of you that's important for you to convey your intelligence or your mastery of the skill set. You're also giving an impression, though, and you're giving an impression to someone before you ever open your mouth. And you can't opt out of it.
This is true, not even on Zoom.
And so I think it's one of those things where you're like, okay, so it actually does matter how I show up. And the good news about it is you can craft the message. It's totally within your control to figure out the message you want to send and then to find clothes that support that and to find a style that is representative of the message you want to send. And if that's not something that comes to you naturally, or if you don't have the time to do the research, then hire someone, outsource it because it's important. So when I'm shopping with, or working with someone, I want to find out first, what are their style preferences? And I help them go through some exercises to tap into that. Because instead of just going shopping immediately, you've done that before, likely. You've kind of bought things. Well, this is on sale. Why not? Or, oh, someone gave me this, and it may not have been as intentional. But when you're crafting your message, you want to start with, where am I headed? What do I want to send? And then you reverse engineer it and you find the clothes that support it. And then you create the outfits. And so that's my approach. And so as part of that, once we identify where you're headed, the style you want to have and the goal, the message you want to send, well, then you have to go to the closet and say, okay, what do I have that supports that? And you need to have a foundation, because if you don't, you can't mix and match and make tons of different outfits. You're going to end up just wearing the same thing every day. So then I help them shop for those pieces, and we have a shopping list, and then we create outfits. And so, it's kind of a methodical process, with the end goal being, this is where I'm headed, and that's going to be my guidepost to getting there.
I love that so much. And as I'm listening to you, Estelle, and I actually can't wait to hear the recording of this, because I think there's so much parallel. And what came to mind to me is you're asking your client to define for themselves what that style is for them and what fits with that style. What do they want to wear? What do they want to do? What are they choosing on purpose? And to me, there's such a parallel to that, taking your own story, right? Where you talked about this very intentional career planning, where you saw the jobs and you went and you researched the positions and you were very attracted to this idea of places where you could go in and reinvent, start from the ground up and design and create. And so to me, there's this real creative process that comes along in the way that you're approaching style, the way that you're inviting your clients to approach style, and in the way that you've approached your own career and how you're, I think, recommending that we all approach our careers, right? How do we want to design them on purpose? And so I just love that analogy. And if I think about, for example, if you're a lawyer and you're looking at job postings on a board, or you're at a law firm and you're looking at all the different lawyers around you and how they practice law, it's being intentional for yourself about thinking about your career, the jobs that you want. And yes, these are other examples of what's available or what's been done in the world. But what if you were to start that process from the ground up and think about, okay, if I started from scratch, what would my perfect job look like? Okay, here's a bunch of lawyers around me. They all have these different practice styles. What practice style resonates with me? So I just think that the way that you approach, the way that your mind works is gold. I'm loving talking to you. I think this is an approach we can all take. And when we are more intentional, I think the answer to the question that you posed, are you happy where you are? That question will start getting answered more and more in positive yes, right? Because you're being intentional about it. And to draw another parallel, if I look at you and the work that you're doing currently, you are wearing multiple hats. And so you've styled not only the role that you're in within your law firm, but also you've styled this role that you have outside of your law firm where you're developing this community of professional, powerful women who are all getting together and talking about style and figuring out for themselves what that looks like. You're working with them one-to-one. And I just love that you've done that for yourself so that, you know, you seem very happy. I love, nobody else can really see us talking, but we're both smiling. This is so fun.
It is fun.
You seem very happy. And I think that's not an accident. I think that comes from designing what you want to do through your professional work on purpose and then doing that in alignment with how you've defined it. So
thank you.
Yeah, I just think that is amazing.
And can I say one more thing that just came to me when you were talking? I think another thing to think about is like the career, like the style, it sometimes takes a lot of trial and error. You may not nail it the first time. And that's okay. I always like to say fail forward. But one thing that came to mind when you were talking about the law school setting is if you're trying to figure out, okay, what area of law do I think I want to go into? You may think you want to go into an area, and then when you actually try it, you may decide you don't like it. And so I always encourage law students to try to obtain those internships in the areas that they're most interested in, because it's much better to find out as a law student that actually I don't like this than 5 years later in the practice in that area. So be open to the trial and error aspect.
I love that. And it hinges on another question that I have for you, which is, when you try that on, right? Like maybe it's style and you're trying on something that is bold, it's different, it's not what people are used to seeing you in, and you know you're going to have comments or reactions, or you're starting out and you're trying different types of work, whether it's, you know, beginning stages and you're trying to decide between solicitor or litigator, or you're further into your career and you're getting more nuanced. How do you know, like, because there's sometimes that initial imposter syndrome, right? Most lawyers who make that transition from student at law school to law firm, I think so many experience that initial imposter syndrome, and then eventually we kind of build on that and get over it. But how do you know whether you're weathering? How do you deal with that imposter syndrome, right? Whether it's weathering through it and realizing this actually does fit with me, or, you know, this really isn't a good fit for me and it's time for me to recalibrate.
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. And I think the way I would answer that is to go into it, whether it's trying on new clothes or a new style or trying out a new practice area, to go into it with a growth mindset. Because you may originally think, I'm not really sure about this, but don't dismiss it so easily. Try it out, give it a good faith try. And then if you're like, you know what, I've tried to embrace this. And the more I've done it, the more I realize it's not for me. Just like trying on clothes and saying, well, so many times, I love this. I love recommending something to a client and they said, I'd never in a million years would have thought to try this on. Or, you know, I'm really not so sure about this. And I just say, well, humor me and try it on. Because you think in your mind that you want something, but until you actually try on the clothes or you actually do the task, you may not realize. And I feel like there's this kind of internal compass that tells you, yes, this feels like me, or no, it doesn't. But it may not always happen until you've tried it a couple times.
Yeah. And I love that you drew the link with a growth mindset. And for listeners of the podcast, I talk about growth mindset from time to time. So it may not be a new concept, but if you're not familiar with that concept, what it really means is it's kind of like Estelle has said, it's keeping that open mind, but it's also giving yourself that grace, right? Looking at it as a first step. So maybe you only ever wear black and all of a sudden you show up in red. And so you might use that as a learning experience or as an experiment, right? I'm going to try red and it has to be a big success or I'm never going to wear red again. It's, okay, what would it be like if I showed up wearing red? And do I like that? Or is it, you know, same thing with your work. If it's taking on a different type of file, it's like, okay, I'm going to take this on and I'm going to experiment with it. I'm not going to hold myself to the standard of having it go perfectly, having to love it the first time, because I think that's where we can really stop ourselves from taking steps, is when we put those expectations and it has to be perfect or else. So I love that you approach style and work and all of it with a growth mindset. It is such a useful concept. I'm still sending, I have clients that I work with where we haven't really talked very much. And I find in the last week, I've sent out to a couple of people that link to the TED Talk that Carol Dweck did.
Yes.
nobody has listened to that, highly encourage. We'll link to it in the show notes. Highly encourage everyone to listen to it. So,
and I'm sorry,
go
that's
on.
just one other thing that came to mind. And it's something that I always encourage law students that are here as summer associates is when you're given a task to do a research project, it's really tempting to want to say, well, it could be this way or it could be that way and provide evidence for both, but not necessarily take a stand on what you think is the best approach. And I always encourage law students, like, give an opinion, state your opinion. Even if you're wrong, the partner is going to be so impressed that you actually took a stand and you supported it. They may say, okay, that's completely wrong. And here's why. Or, but they're gonna respect you more for having taken a stand than if you were waffling. And so I think if you can embrace that fail forward, I may be wrong, but I'm going to try to add value and I'm going to try to think through it in a way that I can support why I think that attorneys should go one way or the other. It's going to help you grow that much more, because then they can tell you, well, actually, this is why I disagree. And then you learn instead of just being like, I don't know, I'm not going to make an opinion. I'm not going to, assert myself.
I love it. I love it. I think on at least a couple of levels, and thank you for sharing that example. Number one, I think just practicing giving your opinion, right? Practicing the skill of what it feels like to take a stand, because you're going to start out doing that in a memo that goes to a partner that's going to get reviewed before anything happens, to you being that person who is making the decision, who's stating your opinion to the client and then living with that decision. And so I think the sooner you can jump into just practicing, the better, because you'll get used to it. You'll get better at it. You'll grow. And I think that second piece of it, which is, let's say you do state your opinion and you are wrong, the resilience you will develop from learning that failure is not the end, right? Failure is a step. And if that happens, you get to move on from there, having learned what it feels like to fail. And for lawyers, especially litigators, I was one of them, in every case, there's going to be a winner and there's going to be a loser. Rarely do you ever see a situation where there's not one or the other. And sometimes you're going to end up losing. And so if you can develop the skill of resilience and realizing, okay, this is not the end. Maybe I didn't win in the case, but we won some strategic advantage, or there was an upside here, or there's closure or whatever. So it's really just developing that skill set, because that will give you resilience that will help you as whether you stay on as a lawyer, whether you decide to do something completely different, but those are serious life skills. So that is such a great example. Estelle, thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
Love it. You've talked a little bit about this, but I would love to know what you love about coaching professional women, in particular about style.
Oh my gosh. I love empowering women, because I think for people who don't easily know how to style themselves, it's an impediment. And it's one that a lot of times people just don't talk about. And so they just feel bad about it. They worry about their style. They either wear something that they saw on a mannequin, which happens a lot with my clients, but it looks really good on the mannequin. And then I brought it home and I did not like how it looked on me. Or they buy a blouse that is styled a certain way on a mannequin. Like, I don't know how else to style this. I was only showing that one way. But the whole point in all that, I guess, is what I'm trying to say is I think that, like anything, style is a skill. And if someone can show you that skill, it's like, let's just remove that impediment. And not only does it remove the impediment when you wear something that you look and feel great in, but it's the ripple effect of how it impacts your life. Your husband will smile at you more. You'll get the barista will compliment you on your outfit when you're getting your coffee. It's just fun. It's a fun way to be. And it's something that was such an easy tweak, unlike going on a diet that may take you 3 months. You can put on a new outfit, wear it, and automatically elevate yourself. And it may be kind of awkward when you first start, because you're like, I'm not used to getting compliments, or I'm not used to attention. But once you embrace it and step into it, it affects everything in your life, and it makes everything better, and it makes you feel more confident and then pursue those goals that you want to go after instead of shrinking.
Totally. And here's a question for you, because I always found as a lawyer, and less so now, but also I've mostly been in virtual in the past 2.5 years. As a lawyer, I always felt very constrained in terms of what I could wear and still appear as being professional. So my closet was full of black suits, gray suits, blue suits, pantsuits, skirt suits, conservative button-down blouses. When I had kids and couldn't iron things anymore, it became something comfortable underneath a blazer, like a sweater or a whatever. Conservative shoes, conservative jewelry. And so I still struggle with this wanting to express myself in a way that's more individual. I work with lawyers. So I'm also thinking, well, I want to appear conservative. And at the same time, I think the world is shifting, right? We've got, with the move to more Zoom and traditional and lawyers working remotely and in the office, along with just general societal changes, I feel like the framework is shifting. And I'd love to know your thoughts on how a professional woman lawyer can show up in a way that maintains whatever level of traditionalism she wants to maintain, while at the same time having that unique self-expression that I think is a part of what you mentioned earlier, distinguishing yourself, right? You want to distinguish yourself in your professional work, the writing, the speaking, all of that. And how do you want to show up for that? So I'd love your thoughts, Estelle.
Yeah, I love this. I mean, that's actually why I started doing style for, in particular, women attorneys, because so many of my friends were coming to me and they were struggling. And I kind of think of it as you progress within your career. I'd say you would probably first start off wearing the black and navy suits that your career service office told you to wear as a new associate, maybe blending in a little more. But I find that at a certain point, you realize that you're sick of blending in. You've reached a certain status in your career where you're sick of looking like everyone else. And what you're putting on doesn't even feel authentic to you. You look at your closet and say, this doesn't even feel like me. And so I think that there are definitely ways you can distinguish yourself and still remain professional. In fact, it's what I love to do. It's how I've expressed myself. You can wear bolder colors, but you don't have to jump in wearing a red suit head to toe. You can try some red heels. You can try a red lipstick. You can have a little black dress and then some red heels, or put like a little black dress and some animal print shoes. You could dip your toe in the water and see how you feel with it. But I think there's nothing more powerful than a woman who knows herself and her personality shines through in what she wears. And you can totally do that and look like a professional doing it.
I love it. I think that phrase of getting tired of blending in, that is it, right? It's you reach that and you drew the parallel so beautifully. When you first start out, you're playing it safe. You're doing what everybody else does, what is expected of you. And at a certain point, when you're tired of blending in, love it, that's when you get to develop and own your own style, just like you would as a lawyer, right? Just as the way that you would speak in court, the way that you would speak to clients, the way that you would decide what kind of relationships do I want to have? How do I want to show up on the phone? How do I want to show up in person? Like, what is the way that I'm going to deliver the good news, the bad news? I think all of it is developing your own style and finding a way, well, first of all, figuring out what that style is and then expressing it. So I just love that. Thank you so much.
And the other thing to mention too is, if style is not your jam, I love it. My husband is always amused that I will scroll through shopping while we're watching TV, and it's relaxing to me. He's like, I don't understand that. I don't get you. But so if that's not your jam, find someone who does understand it. Because what I always tell women is, like, there is a world of brands out there that are great for professional women, and it's not confined to the stores that are in your mall. There's a huge wealth of online brands and stores that you may not have been introduced to. That's my favorite thing to do with clients, is introduce them to a new go-to brand. But don't constrain yourself. Research the options that are out there. And if you can't do it or you don't have the time, hire someone to do it for you. It's a limiting belief to think that, well, all I can wear is something from, Ann Taylor or J. Crew. Nothing wrong with those stores, but there's other brands out there that carry blazers that might have some kind of detail that makes it look a little edgier. Maybe there's a cool zipper, or maybe there is an asymmetry in a blazer that's fun, that feels a little fresh and edgy like you. You don't have to go all crazy and walk into court with a, motorcycle jacket. you can get the feel of it with a slight asymmetry in the jacket.
I love it, with like a mohawk to match. I love it.
Exactly.
I love it. Estelle, one of the things that you just said reminded me of something, and the way you talked about, if you don't want to do it yourself, you can always bring somebody else in to do it for you. And what I love about that idea is that sometimes we are so used to seeing ourselves a certain way, and the people around us are so used to seeing ourselves a certain way. And I remember a career strategist talking about the difference between warm leads and cold leads. So when you're looking for a job, a warm lead is somebody that you already know, who you can reach out to, who can help connect you to somebody else. A cold lead is somebody who has never met you before. And so this particular strategist was saying, you want to talk to your warm leads. You want to, if they can help you and they want to help you, great. But those warm leads are going to see you in a different light than the cold leads. And so what you really want to do is put yourself in front of people who don't know you, who don't have a preconceived notion of who you are and what you're capable of and what kind of a role you'd fit well into, because they might see you completely differently. So to draw that parallel back, if you are seeking out style advice from somebody who is just seeing you for the first time, they might be able to imagine and have the vision for you that is so much more in alignment with who you are now versus who you think you are. And so I just think that's a really neat idea for anybody who's curious to just experiment with, right?
Exactly. I always say
people come up with.
Have fun or, go experiment in your own closet, put things together that you wouldn't think would look good together. And you may, land on something fabulous. There's no harm, no foul, play with it, see what you can come up with.
So true.
And if playing with it is daunting or scary, then find a guide. But, it's just clothes, but it is just clothes. But at the same time, the impact of how you feel when you wear clothes that make you feel amazing is huge.
I love it. Question for you. So one thing that I think is really powerful as a professional, and we are talking about women professionals, is presence, right? When you're in the room with somebody and they just have a way of being present. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how women can use style to enhance their presence.
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts about this.
But, love it. I'm excited to hear them. So is everyone else.
Well, one of the things that I think is when you feel amazing in your clothes, you are no longer thinking about your clothes. You are thinking about your argument. You are trying to be persuasive with your words. You're not fidgeting in your chair wondering if your skirt is hiked up too much when you sit down, or worrying if, oh gosh, this was really a bad choice on the neckline. I'm really hoping I'm not accidentally flashing opposing counsel. So I'm going to keep fidgeting with it and moving it around because I'm really uncomfortable. And then you're not focusing on the task at hand. And so that makes you less powerful, less persuasive. So when you have it dialed, basically style then becomes a non-issue, and you can use your mental capacity in being persuasive in your job or in making a pitch or something like that.
Yeah, I love it. And a few things come to mind to me. Number one is fabric. As you were talking about that, I'm hyper allergic to anything that is scratchy, like those wool sweaters. If I'm warm and I'm wearing a wool sweater, I'm immediately uncomfortable. I have such focusing on what's going on in the room because I'm so itchy. I'm just like, Paula, don't scratch your face. And so there are certain things. And at the same time, thinking about what we were talking about earlier, being intentional with your style, when you want to appear crisp and clear and non-distracted, I mean, that might be the look that you're picking when you're going to court versus you're having a meeting with a client and you're delivering some news that you know is going to be difficult. What is the approach you want to take? Do you want to be wearing the hyper black polished power blazer, or is it something a little bit softer because that's the relationship that you're having? And so I just love that idea of what you wear being sort of that initial milestone. And once you've cleared it, you can move on and focus on what you're there for. And so I think that's a really powerful way to think about it.
Right. And what you just said too is you can have different styles based on the occasion, like you just said, and thinking about who's the audience and how am I going to project? Do I want them to feel comfortable with me, like you mentioned? Like I've worked with people who are family attorneys, and they don't want to come across as these hard charging people all the time because their clients are telling them really sensitive personal information. And so they want to come across as relatable, as kind, and yet knowledgeable. And so there's so many different personas that you could create, but you can also tweak it depending on your audience. And there's a whole other line where I could get into the psychology of color, but I won't because that's a long discussion. But there are ways that you can also pick colors intentionally based on the message you want to send. If you want to send a powerhouse message, maybe you're going to wear red or black. But blue is a color that's very relatable, and you come across as responsible and reliable. So.
No, I love the psychology of color. I wish we had more time because
I know.
I would totally ask you to go down that route because I think for all of us, these are things that we don't necessarily think about consciously, but once you are aware of it and you start making those choices on purpose, you might realize, okay, now I understand why it is when I'm meeting with this particular client, I want to show up a little bit differently because the message that I'm sending is of a different nature. And so I think, and not just at work, right? Like this is also with our families and with our friends. And how do we want to show up in different relationships? If it's a weekend or if it's, Monday morning. So, and what do we need? Speaking of Monday mornings, sometimes it's dressing the part that you wish that you felt as opposed to how you actually feel. So you might be feeling like this is going to be a tough day and I'm not really feeling very motivated. Whether you can shift that, and I think you can by choosing to show up intentionally in your most professional setup versus, rolling in with, if you're working at home, rolling into your pajamas and just saying, okay, I'll just try to make it through the day. It does have an effect on us. So,
and the whole look good, feel good. If you're in kind of a bad mood and you put on, bright green, I mean, you can't help but smile if you're wearing something fun like that, and it can help you turn your mood around. As much as the messages that you're sending to other people, you're also sending a huge message to yourself. You see yourself in the reflection everywhere you go. And, send the message that you care about yourself and you care about how you show up, and it matters.
I totally agree. And you said this initially, but I think it's worth highlighting again. It's not as though style is one certain way that we need to show up that is the way that everybody looks on Pinterest or on the cover of the magazines or anything like that. I think it's, again, coming back to ourselves and thinking about how we like to show up. Do we like to show up sort of, I'll use the example. I never paint my fingernails. I love it when other people paint their fingernails. I don't do that for myself. And that to me feels right. That's my style. And so it's not necessarily that we have to do something. It's that we've chosen it on purpose and we feel good in owning that decision. So I just think for all of us, it's not looking like somebody else. It's being intentional in who we are. So I just love that. My next question for you, Estelle, and we're getting close to time, so I don't know how many more questions we have, but here's one. Okay. How do you recommend letting go of an old identity? How do you move from, say, playing it safe to taking on a more bold or a more distinct identity for yourself?
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of intentionality because we're just creatures of habit. And so if you're not intentional about it, you're going to feel more comfortable going back to Old Faithful. And so there are a couple ways I think you can go about curating or creating this new elevated look. The first is having a visual. So when I'm working with clients, I do an exercise on Pinterest, and it's really just for them to kind of not think a whole lot about it, but just to kind of find things that they're drawn to. They don't know why, but they just are, and just make these quick decisions. Then you can have a Pinterest board or, do the good old fashioned vision board, right? Where it's something that you can refer back to, whether it's a vision board that you put on poster board that you have it in your closet, or it's a Pinterest board that you look on your phone. And when you're making shopping decisions and trying to purchase new things, you can just say, does this reflect where I'm going? And you can literally look at the Pinterest board and be like, no, that would be old me, not new elevated me. And it can be a good check-in point just to be like, nope, we're not making future decisions based on my old persona. But another thing that I do when I'm working with clients is, so after you figure out where you want to go and you've come up with this new style statement, when you're going through your closet and you're trying to decide what earns its way back in the closet, a question you can ask as you pull up a garment is, does this say badass professional or, dumpy housewife? Okay, that's got to go.
I can tell you what's in my closet right now, but that's totally off topic.
I'm using this as an example. There are many things I've said, okay, that's a dumpy housewife, got to go. So no judgment. But, like asking the question, does this going to, tearing down, like just do your skirts one day, do your blazers one day. You don't have to do this all in one fell swoop, but go through and just ask those questions. Does this convey, whatever that style statement you have, or does this convey relatable, knowledgeable professional? And you're looking at your work clothes. If it doesn't, then that's like a really good litmus test, and just make quick decisions. Be like, nope, and get rid of it. And then you start filling in with the new clothes that you then, again, base your decisions on that visual or that Pinterest board.
Estelle, I'm like nodding my head and so delighted with everything you just said. And again, I'm thinking about your closet, and I'm also thinking about all of us and our work, right? It's like how our jobs evolve, the things that we did 5 years ago, for example, maybe those are no longer in our work closet. We're
Yes,
clearing those out
exactly.
and someone else gets to take those
Exactly.
on. And I just love that idea of being intentional and having that future vision. Okay, here's the Pinterest board that reflects how I want to show up. And there's also that notional Pinterest board of where I want my career to be going. And so
Yes.
in your practice, in terms of your own style, in terms of your career, how do you gauge how far out you want to go, right? I mean, we're all evolving and the world is
Yeah.
changing and the styles change and the jobs change, ways that people work change. So how far ahead do you recommend looking when you're creating like a signpost, whether it's a style guidepost, whether it's a career guidepost, and maybe it's different for each of them, but how far out do you recommend looking?
Gosh, that's such a good question. They always say you could do the different approaches where you could have what's my 20-year approach, what's my 10-year approach, what's my 1-year approach, So there are different ways of looking at it. But just in my own career, I think that I'm always wanting to grow and learn and see how I can improve or hone my skills. And I think in other positions where I've been in, there comes a point where you've kind of maxed out and I don't know, I like a new adventure. How can I parlay what I've done to then pivot and learn and grow even more in a different direction? And so I don't know if there is a concrete, it's at this moment. I just feel like it's a gut check that you feel.
Yeah. I feel like that's how it happens, right? It's like we're on a path, things are going, they're fine. And then it's almost like you hit a wall and you start to see, wait a second, it's time. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, so like you said, you can embrace where you've been. It's not a rejection. Everything you do builds on each other and it just gets you closer to that next big decision. And so it's not a rejection per se of where you've been or what you've done, but it's like you're building a tapestry, right? And every piece has its part. But if you want to be intentional, at some point you sometimes need to shift and pivot.
Totally. And I think for going back to what you said earlier, having those different points in time, I think sometimes I love doing the 1, 3, 5. I love the 20. And each of them brings to mind a different stage of where you're going to be, right? It's a lot more accessible to think a year from now. So maybe if you're doing it with your notional Pinterest board, how you look or how you practice or what you're doing 5 years from now, it's a bit harder to define because it's further away. But with a year, you can say, okay, I know where I'm wanting to go, at least notionally. What does that look like with more granularity, both in terms of style, so picking what that's going to be, but also in your work? Okay, well, I know that the nature, the substance of my day-to-day isn't going to be completely different unless you completely change jobs or do an overhaul that has a quick transition point. But for most of us, it's building what we already have and then deciding, okay, I'm going to weave in more of one thing and I'm going to let go some of this other thing. So I just love chatting with you, Estelle. I wish you'll have to come back.
I feel the same.
You'll just have to come back. I've got ideas. So one last question for you. And then I would love for you to share where everyone can find you in terms of your Facebook group, in terms of the type of work that you do. If you could go back in time, right? Estelle, who is graduating law school, you've got one of those black caps on and I don't know, if you throw it in the air. I can't even remember if we did such a thing. But what would you share with her, right? Going back however many years that is for you.
Gosh, I think I would tell her that it's not as serious as you think it is. Because I think when you first start that whole imposter syndrome, you're like, I'm going to ruin this, I'm going to mess this up. I would tell her to have fun, to explore, but to have intentionality and create her path, that it doesn't have to be created for her and that it's okay if it changes and pivots along the way, as long as you're true to yourself, and know that you will get there wherever that there is, and to enjoy the ride.
I love it. Estelle, you're such a gift. Thank you. For everyone who would like to have more Estelle in their life, which I think everyone listening is probably like, yes, please. Where can we find you?
Yeah, I think the best place to find me is in my free Facebook group. A long time ago, I tried to constrain and figure out, okay, where in social media do I want to have my presence? And I really focused on a Facebook group because it's a lot of women attorneys. It's women who care about their careers and who want to be more intentional. And so it's called Powerhouse Style. And I'll send you the link and you just answer a few questions so I can kind of get a feel for what it is you want. And I just provide a lot of encouragement, style tips and advice, and just share things that I'm finding that I like that may be of benefit to others. And there's just a lot of other badass women in the group who are professional and like-minded. And it's just a really fun, almost a curated group of women badasses. I've said that a lot. Sorry, I probably shouldn't keep saying badass, but that's the word that comes to mind.
It's one of my favorite words. I love it. I love it. Estelle, thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure. We will provide that link in the show notes. And so for anyone who's looking for it, you will find it. If you can't find it, you can always send me a note and I will send it to you. And it has just been such a delight and such a pleasure. So Estelle, thank you. Thank you again for joining us. Oh, it was such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. I've had a blast. This has been so much fun.
Oh, me too. And thank you for everyone who joined us this week. I hope everyone's having a fabulous week. And yes, I think we will have to find ways to bring Estelle back for more. So take care, everybody. And we'll see you again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.